those at the end. And then to introduce tonight's speaker, I am welcoming Dr. Michaela Gunther, who is a professor of wildlife at Cal Poly Humboldt. Ooh, I almost went back there to Humboldt State. At Cal Poly Humboldt in the Department of Wildlife. And I've had the pleasure of working with Michaela now on the Conservation Council for over a decade. And she is one of the founding members of the council. So it's a joy to get to do this with her each year. She organizes our lecture series and puts in a lot of work and brings us wonderful, diverse speakers on all these varied topics. And it's just fantastic. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to reiterate what Ruth said about being grateful and appreciative that so many of our community members came out on this cold and wet night. And also thankful to our Zoom members who are joining on Zoom for this virtual lecture today. So we're having a watch party here at the zoo, and we're joined together to appreciate some time from our speakers. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Biologists from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which we affectionately call CDFW as the acronym. And Molly Alves is the Beaver Restoration Program supervisor, and she's going to be talking to us tonight about California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Beaver Restoration Program. She's been working at CDFW since 2024, but before that, for 10 years, she was working on a tribally led beaver reintroduction program in Washington State. So she's been doing this for a long time, and I'm really excited to hear about her expertise and experiences. She's accompanied by her colleague, Kyle Pagel, who's been working for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2019 on a variety of their projects. And they have joined together to, they were sorry they couldn't make it in person. They're working in the field now, and so that's why they're coming to us virtually. They're going to tell us all about how this program got started, what some of the accomplishments are, what's in store for these beavers, how they target sites and target beavers, and also how the public can get involved. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks to you for coming, Molly and Kyle, meeting you virtually. And I look forward to hearing about your work.
All right. Hi, everyone. Just want to double check everyone can hear me while I share our slides.
Yep, we hear you great.
Awesome. All right. Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting us to join you tonight. Thank you for the folks that are there in person and those that joined us on Zoom. We deeply regret not being able to be there in person tonight, but appreciate folks coming to learn about our Beaver Restoration Program. So my name's Molly Alves. In a little bit, you'll be hearing from my senior environmental specialist, Kyle Pagel, and let's get into it. If I can figure out how to advance slides. There we go. All right. So some of you may be familiar with our program, but for those that aren't, our program was established very recently in 2022 by an act of the state budget. And the purpose of our program is to work with tribes, NGOs, private landowners, and many others in the state to implement beaver coexistence and really beaver-assisted restoration projects in the effort of promoting habitat restoration and climate change resiliency in California's landscapes. A couple years later, in 2024, the program was officially codified into the state law, and so we are now a permanent program under CDFW, which is very exciting. And so the mission of our program, you can see here, is to gather a comprehensive understanding of where, when, and how beavers can be utilized, or we can partner with beavers to restore ecosystem processes and habitats around California. We want to communicate those findings in clear and meaningful ways, and with that knowledge, utilize beavers as a nature-based solution to restoring and conserving habitats and watersheds for the species that are within CDFW's purview. And so why beavers, some people ask? It's because they're commonly known as a keystone species and an ecosystem engineer. And they are known as this because beavers build dams. And the reason that beavers do this is to create what we call aquatic escape cover. So on land, beavers are we like to call them like goofy chicken nuggets that everything likes to eat. But in water, they're very agile and fast and graceful. And so in building these dams, they create the aquatic habitat that they need to escape predation. And in doing so, and especially when beavers are widespread on the landscape, this creates amazing wetland habitat that supports many other species in California. In felling trees for their woody foods, they contribute large woody debris to our waterways, which is amazing for salmon habitat. They can excavate canals from the edges of their ponds to access food resources, which really helps to reconnect floodplains. And they restore riparian vegetation. And so all of these activities that they do on the landscape help to increase ecosystem resilience to climate change. They do this by creating wildfire breaks on the landscape, which is very important in these times in California. They can recharge our groundwater as well as store it during summer base flows. And they can sequester carbon as well as other pollutants in our waterways. These dams also decrease downstream sediment transport and deposition, which again is really important for salmon rearing habitat. And they reduce channel incision, which leads to a lot of our downstream flooding. And so all of these things really help to create and restore critical habitat for both wetland and riparian obligate species, including the state's threatened and endangered species. And so when the program was established, we were given 4 funding directives. The first is to promote human beaver coexistence strategies to improve our management of beavers that are considered conflict animals, develop a beaver management and restoration plan, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, conduct our beaver translocations specifically for restoration purposes, and do what we're doing right now, which is conducting outreach and education to stakeholders and the public. And so that first directive, addressing human beaver conflict, as beavers are starting to naturally restore themselves in areas of the state that were hit pretty hard by the fur trade days, primarily in our lowland ecosystems, they come into conflict with human values in human-dominated areas. That can look like impacts to infrastructure, like plugging roadway culverts, felling trees, creating hazard trees near roadways and trails, flooding out roadways, damming into earthen dams or levees, and threatening those structures. And all of these things in extreme conditions can be real human health and safety concerns. And so currently, the way to get support from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, if you have a conflict beaver on your property, is to submit a wildlife incident report to our wildlife incident reporting system, or we commonly call it the WIR. And previously, before our program came to be, a lot of those incident reports resulted in what we call a depredation permit. And this is really a lethal take permit to remove that animal from a property. But just a couple of years ago, we made a change to that policy. And so it still remains that our department shall issue permits in situations where beavers are causing human health and safety issues. But where the change lies in that policy is that now our conflict responders, which are stationed statewide in our regional offices, first need to verify that the issue is beaver caused. They need to assess the benefits and impacts to listed species in the areas that landowners are wanting beavers removed. And the most important thing is that they now have the ability to identify and recommend feasible non-lethal deterrence or coexistence strategies and ensure compliance in the use of those strategies. And so the use of coexistence is voluntary, but in the future, if you're given a depredation permit, and a conflict responder recommends the use of coexistence strategies, there could be conditions placed on that permit that prevent you from getting future permits. And this is really in an effort to, one, reduce the amount of lethally managed beavers in the state, but also to provide longer-term solutions to beaver conflict in areas that they're currently happening. And so there are a number of non-lethal deterrents, that can be used for a variety of beaver conflict scenarios. And what these devices do is they enable beaver occupancy while maintaining human values. In most cases, the key goal of these coexistence resources is to either exclude or deceive beavers. And all of these devices are highly adaptable to specific situations, which you can see in this table. There's a number of different categories of beaver conflict and the types of devices that can be used based on that category. And what we really want to emphasize here is that coexistence provides a longer-term solution to beaver removal, whether that's lethal removal or translocation. These devices can last up to 10 years with proper maintenance and really save landowners a lot of time, effort, and money when they choose to implement coexistence solutions rather than have beavers removed from their properties. And so the Beaver Restoration Program does not deal directly with beaver conflict scenarios, but we do coordinate very closely with our internal conflict responders statewide, as well as a bunch of coexistence practitioners, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So when conflict responders have questions for us about what to do in a specific wildlife incident report scenario, we provide non-lethal recommendations. We're in the process of creating a coexistence toolkit that will be used to educate our staff internally, as well as be available on our website for landowners to use. And what this toolkit is build sheets for each type of recommended non-lethal deterrent based on your conflict category. And so folks can go to that and be able to actually implement these resources on their own, on their properties, to prevent lethal management of beavers. It will also provide funding resources, which I'll get to on the next slide. And then there's also a nexus for our translocation projects when it comes to conflict beavers. In cases where there are no viable coexistence measures, which is typically when beavers are burrowing into earthen dams, levees, or road grades, there isn't really a coexistence fix for those scenarios. And so in those cases, we talk with our conflict responders and see if that's a viable source population for our beaver translocations. Essentially, in cases where beavers will be lethally managed, we can repurpose those for our restoration program. And so one thing I want to emphasize here is that translocation is not a readily available conflict management tool. We have a very limited capacity in our program, as well as a limited number of places where we are currently approved to place beavers. And so we have to be very selective in where these beavers are coming from. And so when there's a conflict incident, there are basically three outcomes for the beaver. You can implement non-lethal deterrents, you can be issued a depredation permit, or those beavers can be translocated under our program. And so we still really want to recommend that landowners who are experiencing depredation submit an incident in the WEIR system, whether the outcome is a depredation permit or coexistence. We still really benefit in beaver management from receiving the location data of where conflict is occurring. When we have an approved translocation project ready for beavers to be restored to, we review those depredation incidents that are active in our wildlife incident reporting system, and we work with the conflict responders to get a referral and start working with the landowners who want beavers removed from their property. And again, want to emphasize that translocation is really not considered a long-term solution to beaver conflict. Once you remove beavers from a property, you have beavers in your area, you have suitable habitat, and beavers will likely return. And that's why we're really trying to emphasize the use of coexistence measures. And so here you can see just a number of situations where we have supported weir incidents by removing beavers who would otherwise have been lethally managed. And so if you go to our website, we have a ton of financial assistance for folks that want to implement coexistence resources. There are several federal grant programs like the Partners for Fish and Wildlife grant, which is used very frequently, and the NRCS, and those provide funding to folks who want to implement these coexistence devices on their properties. In the meantime, we realized that we couldn't just tell people to use coexistence without actually providing some support. And so last year, we gave $2 million in grant funding to a nonprofit in the state to create a non-lethal beaver conflict program. And so this past summer, we had our first beaver coexistence training and support program. We certified 25 folks who are now certified coexistence practitioners that are distributed across the state, and they have the technical knowledge to assist landowners with actually building these structures properly and in the right locations on their property. And it also provides a cost share element so that the financial burden, which can be seen as a burden to landowners, can help them justify the cost of coexistence, which we consider to be a long-term investment. And so if you look at the California Beaver Help Desk, that is where you will go now to get access to these technical and financial resources. And we still ask that folks submit conflicts to our wildlife incident reporting system, regardless of whether they plan to implement coexistence, just so we still have that beaver management data that really helps us decide where beavers are coming from and where they're going and where the most conflicts exist. And so now I am going to turn it over to Kyle to tell you about our translocation process.
All right, thank you, Molly. Okay, so basically Molly detailed the background on everything and detailed how beavers coexistence issues can be essentially our source beavers for our translocation. So moving on to the translocation process itself, once a project is approved, we need to identify and scout a source population. So we use that WIR, the Wildlife Incident Reporting System, look up locations where beavers are having coexistence issues, and then we will identify and scout a source population. And so with that, we develop a capture and translocation plan. And this plan must be approved by all different parts of CDFW, so HQ, and then the source region where the beavers are coming from, and then the translocation region or the receiving region where the beavers are heading to. Sometimes that can be the same region, but we just need to make sure that different areas of CDFW are aware and approve of translocating these beavers. So once a plan is approved, trapping can begin. And during this ongoing trapping process, all the captured beavers will be moved to CDFW holding facilities. And these holding facilities work as a way for us to quarantine animals, do health screenings, and do workups and tagging. So while trapping activities are going on and we're capturing beavers, we establish a set of capture objectives prior to trapping when we do site evaluations and we scout the sites. This is usually used from us walking and doing surveys or setting out game cameras and trail cameras, and helps us determine essentially the number of target beavers that are located at the site and their family structure. So we know when to be done trapping or how many beavers are on the site and what we should be trying to trap for. We utilize two different types of traps. We use cage traps, which you can see in the top photo. and we use suitcase traps, which is in the bottom photo. These are live traps, and they're set in areas of high beaver activity, so either on runways and beaver slides, essentially where they're sliding off the bank into the water. We set them on dams, and we set them in and around lodges and burrows. And then once we're done trapping, we set up, or we continue to use the game cameras, and we do sign surveys, and we also note discontinuation of dam building to verify that the trapping effort is complete. So then we trap beavers. So what do we do with the beaver when we do trap it? We move them into captivity. Like I said, we have 2 facilities for holding beaver currently, and these are both CDFW properties. We have the Wildlife Health Lab in Rancho Cordova, just outside of Sacramento, and then we have the Judas Nutria Pens, which are located in Los Banos. So we have 2 areas or locations in the valley where we can hold beavers, and all these beavers are temporarily held while trapping is ongoing. So we'll trap a site, we catch a beaver, it moves into captivity while we're still continuing to trap the site for the remaining beavers located at that site. And this captivity acts as a quarantine period to prevent the spread of diseases and pathogens, because we're moving these beavers across the state from distinct areas. So we don't want to be moving any diseases or pathogens from one site or one area of the state to another. And so holding them in these facilities and flushing the water out and treating them all works for us to prevent the spread of disease, pathogens, and aquatic invasive species. So we also see we've completed some renovations to the Wildlife Health Lab facility in the last year to further make them more efficient for holding beavers specifically. So then while these beavers are being held, like I said, we're using it as a quarantine period and doing some health screening on all of the animals that we're holding. So beavers are held in captivity for a minimum of 3 to 5 days for quarantine, and that's for each individual. And typically we don't hold them any longer than 14 days. So all these beavers enter captivity. If it's the first beaver of a family group that's trapped, it might be there for longer than 3 to 5 days. But if it's the last beaver trapped, it's going to be there for at minimum 3 to 5 days to make sure that each individual is quarantined. And we use this holding period also as a method to move all of these beavers together so that we're moving intact family groups to a site. So when we do a release, it's all of the family group at once. And so each of these beavers upon intake are treated with ivermectin, and that's to flush out internal parasites. And then we also use essentially different measures of water quality. We change out the water in the pools regularly to give them fresh water as a way to flush out parasites and continue giving them clean water. And then we also test the water for coliforms, and we have been consulting with lots of different organizations like Smithsonian, Point Defiance, Monterey Bay Aquarium, San Diego Zoo, and more to make sure we're up to standards. So then while these beavers are in captivity, we do work them up. We essentially, on intake, we put beavers in what's called a beaver bag. You can see a miniature version of it there. It's like a heavy-duty pipette bag or a piping bag for baking. And beaver goes in the small cone end and faces that way, and then we get access to the beaver from the larger end of the beaver bag. And we're able to sex beavers, determine their age class, weigh them, and do some body condition scores on them while they're in the beaver bag. And then we are also able to tag them while they're in the beaver bag. So we tag our beavers in a variety of ways. Each beaver receives, at the very least, ear tags or Floyd tags, which you can see in the top right photo on the little kit. They're essentially little colored ear tags that come off the back of the ear that help us identify individuals. So every beaver gets that. Every beaver gets a pit tag, which is essentially very similar to the microchip that your cat or dog might have in case they get lost. Each beaver will receive a pit tag, and we use those pit tags for couple different reasons, but helpful for IDing them. And then we also use them, I'll show later on, we use them in post-translocation monitoring using pit tags that are in stream. And then certain beavers, typically just adult beavers or very large subadult beavers that may disperse following translocation, they receive tail-mounted transmitters in the form of either a GPS tag, which is store on board, or essentially stores all the data on the tag. So we have to get within range to download the data, or they get a VHF tag, which is your classic radio tag for telemetry, which beeps constantly for you to be able to hone in on where the animal's located. And so tail tag beavers are chemically immobilized. That makes it easier for the beavers and for us to apply the tags. And then during this time when they're immobilized, samples are collected for disease and parasite testing and genetics. So we collect blood samples and some biopsy punches. So moving off of the beavers themselves and more looking at our projects that we've done for our program since we started. So in 2023 and 2024, we focused on pilot projects. So our first two pilot projects were with Maidu Summit Consortium in Plumas County, and then with the Tule River Tribe on their reservation in Tulare County. And then just this past year in 2025, we started implementing new projects that were submitted through our formal project proposal. And so we had 3 projects that were on private, municipal, and federal lands. And to date, we have translocated 42 beavers made up of 10 distinct family groups. And we've sourced them from 7 different conflict sources, ranging from NGOs, state wildlife areas, and municipalities. And so we've talked about how we get the beavers, we've talked about how we hold them in captivity and then prep them for moving them. So the question is, where do we move them to? And so the first part of that equation is that CDFW translocation policy restricts translocations to a species native range or their historic native range. And so that opens up the question of what is the native range or historic native range of beavers in California. And so that's something our program is working on to determine the native range based on best available evidence. Previously, the native range was considered to be essentially the area that is in the cross-marked section, but that didn't take into account areas that were likely inhabited prior to the fur trade. And that's based off of lots of primary sources of trapping journals and different details. And those areas that were previously not considered part of the native range is Southern California watersheds, coastal California watersheds, and high elevation watersheds like the Sierras. And so this new determination will take historical context into account, a modern understanding of beaver ecology and biology, and traditional tribal knowledge into account. So then we need a site to place these beavers. So looking at it on an even finer scale, we've determined that it's within the native range. We need to go to these translocation projects that have been submitted as proposals and look at the site. So the first step of this is a proposal is submitted to our program using the online proposal form that we have located on our website. That proposal, once it's submitted to us, is then reviewed using our project prioritization model, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then when or if that project is prioritized, our staff goes to the site to conduct a suitability assessment. And essentially what we look at when we're walking around the site is we're looking at how ready the site is or how conducive the site is for beavers to stay at the site and survive and have enough food and resources to persist on the landscape, and B, how much impact beavers can have from a restoration perspective. And so if improvements are needed, another site visit might take place after improvements are implemented, after we recommend those improvements, and if the site has conditions that disqualify it from beaver translocation, the proposal is removed from the candidate pool. And then if approved, a site awaits beaver translocation. So then looking at this project prioritization model that I just talked about, essentially we've taken into account many different variables that identify watersheds with the highest ecological benefit potential from beaver translocation. And some of these variables are changes in key climate variables, sensitive species distribution, regional biodiversity, wildfire severity and probability, significant anadromous habitats. And so kind of putting all of these factors together on a watershed level scale to find priority watersheds that there's different priority weightings to it that can suit our unique project objectives and help us make better decisions on which projects should be prioritized. And then we've moved past all of the steps, and the only thing remaining now is to actually translocate the beavers to their new spot. And so when it comes to translocation, we have a translocation agreement that takes place between CDFW and the landowner or agency or whoever's acting as the landowner there. And this agreement essentially means that gives us access for post-translocation monitoring to check up on the beavers and see what type of restoration is occurring. But also probably the most important part is that there's a conflict management acknowledgement. So this is important to essentially have us, like Molly talked about in the beginning, we are trapping and translocating beavers that are already causing conflict or having coexistence issues, and that would otherwise be lethally removed. And this is our way of making sure that the landowner knows that we're moving these beavers to your property. You won't be able to, you need to find a way to coexist with them, and that we won't be submitting anything on the weir for these beavers. So beavers are then transported with their family group to the translocation site in climate-controlled vehicles, and the initial release takes place, and then we, based off of monitoring, can determine if subsequent releases take place, and these releases are used to introduce new genetics to new populations and introduce new genetics to some isolated existing populations. So we've released the beavers, and now comes even more work. So we do some post-translocation monitoring. And when it comes to post-translocation monitoring, we're looking at essentially two different large categories that we cover. So the first part is looking at and monitoring the beavers themselves. And then the other part is looking at the ecosystem's response to these beavers that we've translocated. So with beavers, we track beaver movement because we want to know if the beavers are staying at the sites that we've released them at and what parts of the habitat that they're using. So we monitor beaver movement through game cameras. We monitor it through telemetry, as you can see in the one photo, based off those tags that we've put in their tails. And then we also monitor them through site surveys of walking the sites and looking for sign, and then also those pit antennas that I talked about. So those little microchips that we put in the beavers, they have, we put them in stream, and essentially when the beavers swim over the top of the pit antenna, it activates the microchip in them, records their unique serial number, and then records the date and time for us. And so we can monitor essentially how beavers are moving around on the landscape. The other metric that's really important is survival. Beaver survival is an easy way for us to quantify the success of a beaver release. So if beavers are going to make the beneficial impact that we want them to on the ecosystem, we need them to still be on the landscape. And then we look at habitat use and we look at reproduction. So one of the important things with reproduction, it's a great indicator of site fidelity or beavers staying on the site. And it's how the beavers spread their benefit across the landscape. So we want beavers to reproduce and have their young disperse across the landscape to further multiply the benefits to the ecosystem that their restoration can have. And then, like I talked about, we look at ecosystem response. So we're looking at changes in fish assemblages and abundance, fish passage, and then we're looking at all sorts of hydrological aspects of this. So really important to our state, especially in a dry state like California, is surface and groundwater volume and recharge, and seasonal flow augmentation. So slowing down flashy flows, keeping water on the landscape for longer into the dry season. And then we look at water temperature and water chemistry, and we monitor all this water through a variety of ways, but we use data loggers that we put in stream or in the water that record continuously. And then we also use our drones. We have some UAS drones that we use, and we take imagery like this photo up in the top left and look at surface water, and we can see beaver activity, and in the future use vegetation indices to monitor changes in water availability and vegetation growth. So then I'm going to quickly run through some project updates. So our initial project release site that we did, I'm just going to hit on the highlights here. We did October 2023 was our first release. We released a family group there. Really cool to see our adult female that we had a GPS tag on traveled downstream 5 miles and then returned. And that happened almost immediately after translocation. And then we observed natural reproduction over that first winter. And these beavers have built a burrow and a lodge and multiple dams, as you can see from the photos on top. And then we did 2 releases additionally at that site. We did one in July of 2024 and another in July of 2025. And those beavers have also been damming and have had natural reproduction observed. And we've actually seen genetic mixing across the valley from all of these different beaver populations that have all been trapped in distinct areas across the state. So we're having good genetic diversity and genetic mixing happening there. And then just a quick aerial imagery or aerial image to show. So on the left is essentially pre-beavers. It's technically post-release, but before beavers started engineering things at the site. And the main thing I want everyone to try and look at is the middle pond. And then if you look up in the top right of each image, you'll see on the left is the pre-beavers, and then on the right is after the beavers tacked in a dam on the main stem. They essentially started flooding and re-wetting this wetland complex. And so they've increased the surface water by quite a considerable amount and added in quite a few dams just to flood out their lodge area. And this is kind of the perfect scenario or ideal imagery that we're seeing and what we hope to see at most sites. So then continuing on, we had our second pilot site at the Tule River Reservation down in Tulare County. We did 2 releases in June of 2024. The first release was at a one site where we released a family group. This site encountered some dropping in water levels following about a 6-week period, and the family group was predated by a mix of bears and actually some wolves. Our second release that we did was on another section of the reservation. We released a breeding pair that you can see in the bottom left photo. And this breeding pair proceeded to dam and burrow, and they actually picked up on one of the BDAs or beaver dam analogs that was installed in the area, and they started building that up themselves. They did active foraging and tree felling, which you can see in the bottom right, so they were quite an active group. And then we've done several releases on another section of the reservation on Windy Creek. Last September we did, or 2 Septembers ago, released the family group. We've seen active foraging and movement from them upstream onto Sequoia National Forest and have observed foraging in the following spring. And then this year we released a pair as a supplemental release for that family group to provide some genetic diversity and increase the numbers on that watershed. So then the 2025 releases that were new and not pilot projects. So we did 1 release on some private lands in Siskiyou County. This was in October of 2025. We translocated a breeding pair And we saw dispersal once again off-site almost immediately. Beavers dispersed off-site and remained off-site for about 6 weeks post-translocation before returning. And we've seen damming, bank burrowing, and lodge building from this group here. You can see they're actively knocking down aspens. And then for the next site, we did a release also in October on municipal lands in Sierra County. This was a family group that was translocated. And once again, it's kind of a trend that we see, at least an individual disperse. We saw one individual that dispersed off-site while the rest of the family group remained on-site. And that individual actually dispersed down a relatively steep river canyon and down a waterfall. So that individual, I don't think, is going to be able to physically return back to the family group, but most of these photos are from that individual that's down in that river canyon. It actually made a bank burrow and has been foraging quite a bit. So interesting to see that they spread out across the landscape. And then our last project we did was in November of 2025. We translocated a family group. We did observe some dispersal off-site, but that was also, we only had a short window that we could monitor them before we got essentially snowed out or blocked out of that area from weather. So that's a to be surveyed following winter group. So interesting mix of info that we've had after all of these new releases, but definitely the dispersal that we've seen is rather fascinating and seems to be quite a trend with these groups. All right, go ahead, Molly.
Trying to figure out how to get my faith back on there. Hold on just a sec. All right. Sorry, it's hard to do this while sharing the screen. So if you can hear me, I'll just talk. So as Kyle just talked about with all of the outcomes of our releases that have been done so far, we have learned quite a bit. This is the first Beaver Translocation program in about 75 years, since California used to drop beavers out of airplanes using parachutes. We have learned some much more effective methodology that we're using these days, fortunately. But as our program expands geographically, we're learning a lot about the geographic variability and seasonal variability in available beaver habitat. And so across the state, we have so many different types of ecosystems. Many of the sites that we've seen have either high velocity flows or ephemeral streams, which really don't support that depth of aquatic escape cover currently that beavers require to really stay in place. And so we're thinking on a landscape scale in terms of where can beavers thrive and establish, but also what is the connectivity to additional habitat in those areas where offspring can disperse to create this landscape scale restoration impact of beaver translocation. We're noticing a lot of areas where forage is a limiting factor. Beavers eat a lot of wood. They eat the cambium of trees, primarily willows and aspens and alders. And a lot of our land management and land use of a lot of the properties where we're getting proposals from are lacking in abundance or an adequate proximity of those forage resources to where the beavers feel safe. And so what we're really looking for is not just the abundance and quality of the forage, but if it's easy for the beavers to access that forage so that they're not at risk of predation. Again, connectivity, we're looking at dispersal through tracking, but tracking is not an exact science, particularly with beavers. They are very difficult animals to track. They spend a lot of their time either in the ground or underwater. and they have what we refer to as a fusiform body shape. And so essentially their head is more narrow than their neck. And so you can't just put a GPS collar on a beaver and expect for that to stay on. And so we are working with a couple different companies to figure out if there are better and less invasive methods of tracking than attaching tail-mounted transmitters to beavers. And so looking forward to this upcoming field season, once accessible with our active projects, we will be continuing to survey them for beaver presence, that overwinter reproduction, and if there's a need for supplemental translocations at the sites that we've already placed beavers at. Over the course of the program, we've received 22 applications for recipient beaver landowners. Of those 22, we have currently assessed 14 of them on the ground. This coming year, we've identified at least 3 of our active sites that will be receiving supplemental translocations. Like Kyle mentioned, we really are invested in creating genetically viable populations that eventually will become self-sustained, especially in areas where beavers were historically removed and are absent. Of our sites that we have not placed beavers at yet, at least 2 of those, but we have more to assess, are what we consider shovel ready. They're ready to receive beavers, and so we'll at least be implementing 2 new projects this year. From those 22 applications, we found that 3 of those sites were unsuitable for beaver translocation, either due to very high and flashy flows, or those ephemeral flows that either have too much water to support establishing dams or not enough water to create that protective cover for beavers. And then we have 6 sites that we've assessed so far that are still essentially on our wait list. These are sites that with a little effort could be suitable for translocation in the future. Kyle had mentioned that we recommend some pre-beaver restoration at some of these sites. So there are sites where there are seasonal considerations to the timing of those releases. There are active restoration efforts happening, or we've recommended that they do some restoration like riparian planting or implementing BDAs in an effort to create more suitable habitat for beavers to stay put. A lot of our process in assessing these sites is looking at the potential for conflict. And so we are taking these beavers from conflict situations. We do not want them to cause conflict in the areas that we're placing them. And so sometimes when there are nearby neighboring landowners, we want the landowners who are requesting the beavers to put in the time and effort to notify their neighbors and ensure that there aren't going to be conflict issues should the beavers leave their property. And then there are others that are in the process of acquiring the lands that they want beavers to be placed on. We require that either the landowner or the land manager of the property submit these proposals. And so we want to ensure that the people who have authority over those lands are the ones requesting beavers be placed there. And so looking forward, again, relatively new program that is expanding rapidly. And so in our efforts to expand geographically, we are really in the need of additional holding facilities. We have 2 in the state, as Kyle mentioned, but additional holding facilities would really enable us to trap beavers in different regions without the need to transport them for such long distances. And so that's something that we're thinking about. We're expanding partnerships with landowning agencies in the state so that we have access to more places to put beavers. We're identifying those priority watersheds and doing outreach with those landowners to really look at beaver restoration on the watershed scale and essentially doing cross-jurisdictional boundary beaver restoration so that we're not just placing beavers on individual parcels and expecting them to stay put. We're also going to be launching a salmon impact study so that we can expand our translocation to anadromous habitat on the coast, as well as a rangeland impact study, because we have a lot of interest coming from rangeland owners, but we want to ensure that we're doing our beaver restoration responsibly in a way that will help these rangeland owners meet their needs. We're also, amongst everything else, working on a beaver management and restoration plan for the state. We are working with our technical advisory group, which is made up of some of the best and brightest scientists, researchers, and practitioners across the country to ensure that the decisions that we're making with this program are using the best available science. There's also a lot of gaps and research needs in beaver restoration work. So we're seeing how our work can contribute to some of the ongoing studies that are happening at these universities and with these other translocation groups in other states. We also want to look at the relationship between beavers and listed species and species of special interest so that we can place beavers in areas where they can really support threatened and endangered species in the state of California. We are integrating some strategies for project prioritization. We're working internally with some of our folks that are working on regional restoration objectives to ensure that we can support ongoing programs, particularly for salmon habitat restoration and other imperiled species, and looking at biodiversity indices and species-specific recovery plans and how we can help out with some other departments within Fish and Wildlife. Within this plan, we are going to define that historic native range of Castor canadensis within California to basically highlight the areas that we are approved under this program to place beavers. And a lot of that work is ongoing with a lot of different partners supplying information to us so that we can make the best determination possible. And then identifying the greatest beaver restoration opportunities. We want to place beavers on CDFW lands. Those are our internal projects. Those external projects are the ones where folks submit a proposal to our program. And again, our goal long-term is to look at watershed scale restoration by combining all of those different programs, proposals, internal projects, and looking at some of the restoration and recovery plans from other agencies as well. And so here is the link to our website, and on there you can find our translocation project proposal form. There is a page on Living with Beaver guidance, and that supplies some information on coexistence resources in the state. We have our Beaver Observation Survey tool, which is a place where folks can directly submit beaver sightings to us, and that is really helping to build our program's understanding of the current beaver distribution in California. As you can see from this map here, these orange parcels are where beavers have been sighted, and we're mining a lot of other information from iNaturalist and iBeaver to get a good sense of where beavers are currently existing so that we can integrate that into our prioritization model and see where beaver translocation is the most needed. On that site, we also have our 2024 status report on beaver restoration projects. And within probably the next month, we will be posting our 2025 status report, our updated beaver restoration project status report. But that's a really good kind of summary of everything that's been done in the first few years of this program. This year, we'll also be putting up our coexistence toolkit, which will provide those build sheets and resources to landowners who wish to use coexistence rather than asking for depredation permits. We will be working more towards our beaver management and restoration plan. We're in the public and tribal scoping phase of that, And so hopefully we will be putting out a draft by the end of the year. And then we will also be posting our updated California Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. This is a statewide GIS model that is used to identify where is the most likely for beaver damming to happen. And it's a really good indicator of where beavers can establish and do the most good from a restoration perspective. We've been working for the past year with the University of Minnesota to update that restoration tool for our state so that it is more effective in a variety of different ecosystem types. And we'll also be putting up the results in the form of an interactive tool of the beaver prioritization model. And with that, that was a lot of information. I'm sure there are a ton of questions, but thank you all so much for coming and listening and learning with us.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Kyle. That was wonderful. We've got a lot of beaver lovers here.
Great to hear. I'm still trying to figure out how I can get my face back up there so I can so you can see me when I answer questions.
Well, we have about 25 folks on Zoom and 20 people here in the audience. So we're gonna start popping you some questions if that's okay.
That sounds great.
Okay, Michaela, we've got one here. And let me know if you can't hear and I'll bring the microphone closer to people.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up there. Hi, it's Michaela. Can you hear me? Hi, Molly.
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks for those great stories, Molly and Kyle. That was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time to talk to our group. I am sure you have considered this, but I wonder what you think about, you said you need some additional holding facilities. Have you considered, instead of permanent holding facilities, temporary holding facilities that you can put at the translocation areas that could then serve as soft release sites? You're having high incidence of animals leaving your translocation site, so maybe they could spend a little time there in a temporary holding facility, and then they'd be less likely to move, and then you'd also not have to spend a lot of money on holding facilities all over the state. You could kind of move it around to where you need it. I know it's expensive, it takes time and resources, but maybe it would be better investment than these permanent facilities. Just wondering what you thought about it.
Yeah, absolutely. We have certainly considered the use of mobile facilities, and we have talked with a couple different programs that have used them. There are lots of concerns, particularly just with keeping the area clean and sanitized over the course of a trapping period, as well as, you know, the areas that we're putting these beavers in. We try to be as non-present as possible. And so bringing these structures into a release location can attract as a novel object some of the predators that we're trying to keep the beavers away from. And so there's been some concerns with the use of mobile facilities. We are definitely not in a place right now to establish more permanent facilities in the state. And so we're working with some rehab facilities to see if there are options to do temporary holding with them, as well as zoo and aquarium facilities that have aquatic infrastructure available. And so that is something that is definitely a work in progress. There are only 2 rehab facilities in the state that are permitted to hold beavers, but there are different rules for temporarily holding them at facilities that already exist. And so shout out Sequoia Park Zoo might be reaching out to you pretty soon to see what the options might be, but we're working out what that might look like and that kind of agreement between agencies and organizations.
Oh, that makes sense.
What a dream.
Are there known historical or current beaver populations in the Eel River watershed? And if so, what would beaver habitat look like in a watershed where the main stem is subject to very dramatic flow fluctuations in the winter?
Can you repeat the first part of that question? It was a little hard to hear.
Historical or current beaver populations anywhere in the Eel River watershed, northwestern California? And then what would beaver habitat look like in an area where the main stem of that river has dramatic level fluctuations several times a year?
Yeah, we were actually out there a couple weeks ago, looking at some habitat with the Nature Conservancy, where they're doing some pretty big salmon restoration projects. And yeah, that area in particular that we looked at is not currently feasible for beaver reintroduction because of those dramatic winter flows. And so in areas like that, all we can do is really recommend any structures you can put in place that can slow and store water and creating primarily off-channel habitat, or rather really beefing up tributaries that feed those flashy systems. Because if you think about, one, beavers can't really establish permanent dams in those flashy systems, but during these flooding events, they need refuge. They have to spend a ton of energy during these flood events to find a place where the water isn't going to wash them downstream, but they typically lose access to their lodges. And so expending this energy, needing to find a place where they can find that refuge, they have a lack of energy and they're often more susceptible to predation. And so it's not impossible. There are beavers within that area, but you really need to put them in a place where they're going to have that refuge habitat, because we know that those dramatic flooding events are going to happen more frequently on an annual basis. And we want to ensure that we're not just putting beavers in a place where they're going to get swept out to sea.
Yes.
I noticed one of the map things up, there were yellow dots that I think represented possible or prospective sites for translocation, and one of them looked like it was in Humboldt County or in our region. Is that correct?
Sorry, gonna need you to repeat the beginning of that again.
It was the slide that had the map with some yellow dots that were maybe possible translocation sites.
I'm wondering if one of them was in our area. It looked like it was.
Kyle, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's a couple sites, one somewhat in the area there, in Humboldt County, and then there's a couple sites that are kind of off inland just a little bit more.
And Kyle, are those sites that have been assessed?
Those are proposals that have been submitted that have yet to be assessed and surveyed by us.
So potential.
Sure. Well, I guess mine is a beaver ignorance question, and two-part. How do you age a beaver, and what does the tails made of?
Sorry, once more.
How do you age a beaver? Because you said you age them, and what are their tails made of?
Actually, their tails are a really good indicator of age. As beavers grow, their tails actually widen and thicken, and so the width of the tail is actually a really good indicator. But primarily, we're aging them based on their weight. Their weight classes are distinguished into kits, subadults, and adults. And their tails are primarily just kind of fatty adipose tissue and cartilage. Basically, when we give them their tail-mounted transmitters, it's like going and getting an ear piercing. But to reduce stress, which beavers are very susceptible to, we immobilize them during that process, as well as for them to remain in the same position and stable while we're administering the tag.
Thank you.
And also just when we're monitoring beavers, like in a professional setting where we get access to a beaver for its whole life, we'll also look at those tails as sort of a measure of body condition as well. Like the fatter beavers have kind of a fatter tail base. So it's an indicator also of how much weight we're carrying as well in an adult beaver. So it tells us all kinds of cool stuff. And I think it feels kind of like a basketball.
It does.
You were any beaver reintroductions or translocations on commercial timberlands?
On what timberland? Say that again.
Commercial timberlands.
Commercial timberlands?
Yeah, so part of what we're doing right now and expanding out of our pilot project phase is really trying to diversify the land use types that we're placing beavers in to show what the potential is, on rangelands, on private timberlands, on federal forest lands. And so, yeah, absolutely. We're really trying to do a lot of education with folks that use their lands essentially for producing resources and show them the benefits of water storage for things like livestock or wildfire resiliency, particularly for timberland owners.
Okay, let me check our chat as well. It is after 8, so if anyone does need to go, of course, feel free. I don't see anything in mine, but let me check with Jen. Oh,
I see a hand.
I see a hand, but I don't think we can unmute, so I think she'll have to submit it to the chat.
See any questions?
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, you guys spoke a lot about sterilizing the area that you keep the beavers in and deworming and cleaning the water. And I was wondering if you can talk more about illnesses that beavers experience.
Yeah, things that are of main concern, one to the beaver's health, but also in terms of zoonotic diseases, where they can transfer diseases to the people working with them or vice versa. Giardia is one that we're testing for, as well as tularemia and leptospirosis. Unfortunately, those are things that are very prevalent in our watersheds statewide. These are a lot of these diseases that beavers carry are from water polluted by, cattle operations. Cattle are a carrier of some of these diseases. And so we're testing for that just to ensure that we're not spreading those to new areas, though some of the areas that we're placing beavers at already have those diseases prevalent. And so we're really just doing the best that we can to ensure that these beavers aren't carrying those primary diseases of concern, but are also in the best physical condition possible when we release them, so that they're able to fend off some of these diseases that are not always necessarily fatal.
Well, great. Oh, one more question here in person, if that's okay.
I thought you mentioned ivermectin up there. So is that given by injection at a pill, or how do you treat that?
Yeah, that's given by injection upon intake to the facility. And so that takes about 3 days to flush internal parasites from the system. And so that's why we're constantly flushing the water that's available to the beavers to flush out those parasites and ensure that they're out of the system and not accessible to new beavers coming into the facility.
All right. Well, Kyle and Molly, thank you so much for coming to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having us. This was fun.